Hi everyone, my name is Alexander Zalivako, and I'm the founder of From A to Z law firm. One of the areas of our expertise are sanctions, and in a series of presentations called Sanctions 360 Degrees, we will look into major sanctions economic regimes and the way they affect the lives of private individuals and corporations. Thank you very much for watching. We will discuss today sanctions against Sudan and South Sudan in the context of our series Sanctions 360. And more specifically, we will touch upon the following points. We will first of all look at the situation in Sudan and South Sudan from the sanctions perspective, so that to understand the background which caused the introduction of international economic sanctions at the UN level and which is behind the current sanctions program against these two countries. We would look then into key military and political players to have a better substantial understanding of why the sanctions target that of the other group. And then we would look into three major conflicts which caused the current sanctions program, which is the general civil war between North and South of the country, which resulted in the creation of the new country of South Sudan, which is the conflict in Darfur, which started at the time when Sudan was still a single state and ended when the state already split in two and re-emerged again in the current Sudan. And then we would try to find some common themes which follow this sanctions program. It's impossible to discuss sanctions which are currently in place against Sudan without briefly touching the background to the current situation in the country. Because unlike many other jurisdictions where sanctions to a large extent is a response to current political developments or some political priorities of certain national jurisdictions, Sudan is indeed the country which is at war for most of its history. So it would be, logically speaking, one of those prime examples where one would expect an active participation by the United Nations with all the tools available at its disposal employed for the purpose of resolution of those conflicts. We certainly do not have time to look in any detail or even in general as to the root causes and the developments of multiple conflicts which occurred in Sudan. Nevertheless, because it is these conflicts which are the basis of the current sanctions program, we need to spend some time on discussing them. The main conflict in Sudan has historically been the conflict between the northern and southern parts of the country. In essence, since its independence, the country for almost 50 years has been at war of different types of intensity. There were local conflicts and the conflicts which caused the country, but there were two civil wars which were directly pitching the north and the south. And historically, the roots of the conflict is described as a difference in religion and ethnicity, north being populated by Arab, mainly Muslim population, whereas the south by Christian, non-Muslim population, exacerbated by British colonial rule, which purposefully wanted to keep the country divided for the purpose of more efficient governance and purposefully developed the north and undeveloped the south, as well as exacerbated by current climate change, which is badly affecting the available farmland in Sudan and is adding additional tensions to these historical matters. Without challenging or disputing the validity of all these courses, we would see that it would be simplistic to position all the ongoing conflicts in Sudan as barely a North-South divide, because even following the independence of South Sudan, which occurred in 2011, the country is subject to the ongoing military conflicts both in the north and in the south, despite the current homogeneity of the population participating. Nevertheless, it's important to appreciate that this north-south divide has huge historic impact on the country, resulted in 2 civil wars and the independence of South Sudan in 2011. In the middle of the Second Sudan Civil War, a sub-war occurred in the western region of Sudan, Darfur. We can see in the map that it's a very big region. Roughly, the population, the area of this region is comparable to the surface of Spain, for example. So it's a very large territory. And we can see that it's roughly 1/3 or close to 1/3 of the territory of what is currently Sudan. So close to the end of the Second Civil War, a conflict occurred in Darfur, again at that time principally along the ethnic lines, exacerbated by lack of farmland. And at that time, the conflict was led by local nomad Arab militia called Janjaweed, which gradually got support also from the Central Sudan government. So this local conflict in Darfur actually lasted for 17 years, started in 2003 and ended in 2020, so following the changes in the government of Sudan itself, and led to crimes which resulted in the International Criminal Court for the first time bringing charges against then President of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. So those charges were brought against him specifically in connection with the conflict in Darfur. Then in 2019, another important historical milestone occurred when, as a result of demonstrations of the students and other civilians, supported though by some army generals, the 30-year rule of Omar al-Bashir came to an end. He was toppled as a result of the coup, and originally the government which came to power was a mixture of civilians and military representatives of Sudan, with the idea that following a certain transition period, the rule of the country will be transferred to the civilian government. Unfortunately, this plan did not come to life, and just 2 years after, a new civil war started now in Sudan itself between two military leaders, which originally coalesced for the purpose of bringing down Omar al-Bashir, but now were not able to share a power in between themselves. And the military groups which those leaders command are the Sudan Army Force and the Rapid Support Force. So what we have as of today are two countries, South Sudan and Sudan, and this division is the result of two civil wars and tens of years of conflict between these two regions. What we also have is another conflict comparable to civil war in Darfur, which occurred between 2003 and 2020. What we have is the civil war in Sudan itself between the two military factions, which reemerged following the toppling of Omar al-Bashir. And what we had in the south, again, during, in essence, 10 years following its independence, is again a civil war in between the two leaders who were originally fighting hand in hand against the central government in Khartoum. So this, in essence, is the stage of the country. And as one might clearly see, it's a situation where the participation of international community in terms of trying to restore peace and security would be paramount. And unfortunately, the response is limited, and the response is mostly based on observing missions, as well as the sanctions program administered by the United Nations and supported by certain national sanctions program, and that's what we would see now. But before doing that, we would briefly go through the main political factions or entities participating in these various conflicts for the purpose of better understanding why sanctions specifically target one of those entities or the others. Surprisingly, if we go at the sanctions lists of the United Nations or United States or European Union, we see persons designated to blocking sanctions from various, sometimes opposing camps. This in essence means that the sanctions programs as such, on the one hand, try to be objective and reflect the reality on the ground, that there were war crimes or other hostilities committed by both camps. But on the other hand, they also presumably demonstrate the lack of politics, because one way or another, it's difficult to imagine the country coming to peace as a result of both of those camps disappearing from national stage. One of the key players was the Sudan People's Liberation Army, which was the key force struggling for the South Sudan, originally led by John Garang and the current president of Sudan, Salva Kiir. Following the independence of South Sudan, the Sudan People's Liberation Army split into two. One became the government, the other the opposition. And these two factions were leading then the internal fight in South Sudan itself. Next three movements: Sudan Liberation Movement, Justice and Equality Movement, and National Movement for Reform and Development, are three groups in Darfur representing the local black population, which opposed the central government of Khartoum during the first conflict in Darfur and during the current conflict there. Then we have the current key players in Sudan itself: Sudanese Armed Forces, which is the official army of Sudan, led by General al-Burhan, who is recognized as the official head of the state. And they are opposing what was originally known as Janjaweed, those Arab militia, which originally was suppressing the local population in Darfur, but then was transformed or integrated into the Sudanese army, still remained in Darfur, and is currently led by General Mohammed Dagalo, who is opposing General al-Burhan in the civil conflict which is currently unraveling in Sudan itself. So then we can generally see three sets of issues which currently are ongoing in the country. The first is certainly the Darfur conflict itself, which is, although original conflict in Sudan is already developing for close to 20 years, and unfortunately did not end in 2020, but re-emerged today with the rapid support forces in essence, been primarily based in Darfur, and on this basis, attacking the local population, which had been historically resident there, presumably with the purpose to achieve some kind of autonomy or preferably independence of this region. So a set of sanctions, going back to the original conflict, followed up by the indictment of Omar al-Bashir by the International Criminal Court, were introduced at the UN level, and then were implemented at the national level by the UN member states. And here I set up the relevant resolutions of the UN Security Council, as well as the implementing legislation at the national level. Another conflict is the conflict of South Sudan itself, which ignited following its independence in 2011, and in essence, again, lasted for almost 10 years, since 2013 up until 2020. This conflict, as we discussed, pitched the two friends during the civil war against Khartoum government, becoming rivals and opposing each other. And again, the resolutions, which are driven by the United Nations Security Council, in essence, put restrictive measures on those persons who are directly involved into this military conflict, who are undermining peace and stability in South Sudan, as well as imposing arms embargo with respect to these countries. And then we have the local implementing legislation, which in essence follow the same resolutions. Finally, we have the current conflict in Sudan itself. So this conflict is unrelated to the original wars between North and South, but is related to the struggle for power between two armed factions, the Sudanese armed forces, led by General al-Burhan, and the Rapid Support Forces, led by General Mohammed Dagalo. As we discussed, previous friends becoming rivals and fighting the war of survival, and in the meantime, committing various crimes in those regions which come under their control or where they need to surrender. While the regimes are three, there are common themes which can be summarized for a sanctions practitioner along the following lines. First point to appreciate is that historically, US really led a separate, very distinct sanctions program towards Sudan, identifying them as state sponsor of terrorism, and on this basis introducing almost a complete embargo for US-Sudan trade, as well as the blocking of all assets of the Sudanese government within the territory of the United States. Those sanctions came to an end following what was at that time perceived to be a transition of power from Omar al-Bashir to the newly elected civil military government of Sudan. And currently the US sanctions regime may be described as being largely in line with those UN-led sanctions which we have just described, with the exception that the list of persons designated to blocking sanctions in the US is larger. And for example, the most recent developments include the designations of both generals leading the war in Sudan as those persons who are listed on the OFAC SDN list, which raises a question of how the ultimate peace process may be led in the country following these designations. Other countries follow largely the UN-led sanctions with respect to the conflict in Sudan, and those sanctions are largely introducing the arms embargo with respect to those parties which participate in the conflict, as well as put limited persons directly responsible for undermining stability or committing serious crimes to the UN blocking sanctions and travel ban sanctions. I trust that you found this presentation useful. Thank you very much for watching.